All right, comrades, we're going to kick off the next session. So Max is going to give a lecture in, I guess, somewhat contrast to the historical perspectives, looking at the contemporary situation as it exists in Australia today, and I guess addressing the question of what small groups of revolutionaries such as Red Ant or others can do or look to do in this situation to try to take the situation of revolutionary organising forward. So the talk Max is going to give, and there'll be time for discussion afterwards, is Political Horizons After 40 Years of Neoliberalism in Australia. Can people's democratic humanist sentiment be relinked to ideology and organisation?
I should say at first that the talk I'm going to give, it hasn't been discussed through in Red Ant formally organisation, so it's not position of Red Ant per se. It's more my own views, although some aspects of it, some aspects of what I'm going to say have been reflected in articles that have been published on the Red Ant site. For those who don't know, but obviously I am a member of Red Ant and have been since it founded. I became involved in far left party politics back in 1981. I joined the Socialist Workers' Party, which then became later on the Democratic Socialist Party. I was on the National Committee and the National Executive of that. Then in 2007, that party went under, experienced some internal conflict, and I ended up in another group, the Revolutionary Socialist Party, which after a few years found it was self-stagnating, and some of us, including some of the members of that, including myself, joined Socialist Alternative for a while, but then eventually left that. Prior to joining the Socialist Workers' Party, I'd been active in social movement and international solidarity politics since really the 60s and 70s. The topic, as you know, is for today's seminar and tomorrow's is Leninism Today. So I suppose I try to take look at the contemporary situation, first of all, asking the question, well, can the ideas that Lenin wrote about and the ideas that he implemented in practice, to what extent is that those ideas and practice, how do you apply them today in Australia's conditions? Because if you think back when Lenin wrote, he wrote in a period of considerable tumult, to put it mildly. Russia itself was in considerable tumult with, you think of the whole process from the late 19th century, 1890s, there were already the political and social movements active in Russia. There was Lenin's own brother had been involved in an attempted assassination of the Tsar. And of course, by 1905, there was the first revolutionary wave, the first Soviet. And then, of course, even before the Russian Revolution, the whole of Europe was in conflagration with World War I. And then, of course, you had the 1917 revolution itself, and the war, the struggle to defend that revolution against the counter-revolution that was launched against it. And of course, as you know, Lenin wrote many things and did many things after the revolution itself. But not only that, not only was Russia, and not only did Lenin write in a period when Russia and Europe was in tumult. Think of what had just preceded what had preceded that period for 100 years before. Scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the first rise of socialism and Marxism, the 1848 revolution, the Industrial Revolution. This is a period in the arts and literature, for example, that saw Tolstoy in Russia, less powerful, perhaps, but from a point of view of political liberalism, you had figures like Charles Dickens and others in England, and even if you want to look at it the point of view of how a new way of thinking was actually seeping into popular culture. You even had Sherlock Holmes, who brought to the ordinary person deduction, or at least a version of deduction, science, and so on. But tumult, class struggle, ideological struggle of both the bourgeoisie against the feudal classes in Russia, proletarian against the bourgeois and its backers. Lenin wrote in a period of tumult and heightened class struggle, ideological struggle as well, science against tradition, etc., etc. Well, how does Australia today compare to that in terms of level of class struggle, tumult, ideological struggle, and so on? I think basically, we're looking at a situation in Australia, which is, sometimes you might tend to think it's dead, it's flat, nothing's happening. Class struggle is minimal if taking place at all. Ideological struggle is narrow and shallow. So how does the writings and the practice of somebody in the middle of tumultuous revolutionary times, how is that relevant to Australia today? And Australia, I think, is a particularly clear example of a flat political situation, even certainly compared to South America, Latin America, where there's still big waves of struggle, or even the United States, which perhaps has not manifested yet large left-wing currents, although you do have, democratic socialists, 80,000 members and so on. But certainly the United States has a much higher level of political polarization than in Australia. So how do we apply Lenin's ideas and the example of the Bolsheviks to this situation we face in Australia today? Well, Lenin wrote many things, including, further deepening and elaboration of Marx and Engels' ideas. And he did many things as well. But it is just two that I want to refer to in this talk. One will actually be dealt with more in depth tomorrow, so I won't go into it in depth today. But one, of course, is Lenin's assessment or his analysis, the understanding he gave of imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, and the general picture of a world where a small number of oppressor nations have a stranglehold over the mass of the other countries, the mass of humanity. A situation, I think, which we in Red Ant argue still exists today, with many changes in the variant and particular manifestations, but no change in that reality. The second aspect I want to refer to is what Lenin wrote. Basically, he wrote many things on this, the role of the party, but the most classic that everyone is really aware of is what is to be done. So I'll be want to be talking about how some of the ideas in that can be, are still relevant and can be applied today. Both the concept that relates to the party, that the concept of professional revolutionaries who have to have a combat style organization that has to be combat style, because just given the nature of the class enemy, its resources and repressive power, but also most particularly the question of a party that can intervene, counter, help or contribute to transforming the kinds of consciousness that arise spontaneously in the working class. But in order to think about those two aspects in the contemporary situation, I think firstly, briefly, on the question of imperialism. Again, this will be dealt with a bit more in detail in one of the sessions tomorrow, but I think that there is very significant ideological and even philosophical or moral imperatives that flow from understanding the exploitive nature the exploitive nature of the relationship between the global North and the global South, the rich imperialist countries and the poor global South countries. It raises issues to deal with to what extent working classes in rich countries are susceptible to xenophobic and racist arguments that are meant to play on any sense of precariousness they have about the relative privileges that they experience. And of course, become very relevant in day-to-day or week-to-week or month-to-month politics in a place like Australia, when you're dealing with, when you have to take a stance towards foreign policy and the defence policies of the Australian ruling class and its state. I think those issues, not so difficult to grasp, the necessity for international solidarity with global South national liberation movements, and the question of opposition to Australian imperialist policies. And of course, you see at the moment in Australia, the necessity we have, and most of the left is doing this, of opposing Australia's policy on things like AUKUS, but also on Australian policies on in terms of Australian government and ruling class defence of the Israeli state. But what about on this question of the party? What's the role of a revolutionary cadre party in a situation where the class struggle is at such a low level? How does it intervene or contribute to transforming whatever consciousness arises spontaneously amongst the working class? The way I think about this is to try and sum up a key, I think in some ways for me, the central, not the only, but it's a very key or almost central or semi-central or whatever, contradiction that exists in the Australian context at the moment. And I think there's, as there is with all contradictions, two sides to this, two sides of the contradiction. I think the first side of it relates to what the consequences have been of 40 years of neoliberalism. Of course, there are economic consequences, the widening gap between rich and poor, the concentration of wealth in a smaller and smaller, the hands of a smaller and smaller percentage of the population, the loss of control, the even greater loss of control than before of the economic processes of the country. But I think there's also an extremely important, and I think, and because I've experienced involvement in politics over half a century now, it's something which I probably feel more than, say, comrades here from a more recent generations, is that there's been a massive change in how bourgeois politics is conducted. Because if you go back to the 1940s, but especially 1950s and 1960s, both sides of bourgeois politics, Social Democrats, Labour Party, etc., as well as the Liberal Party, both sides in their electoral campaigning, which was their main, basically their main campaigning, both sides promised they would improve the conditions of life for the population. Of course, their promises might have been false, or lies, or tricks, or half-truths, but both sides promised this. No one went to the election saying, vote for us because we will make your conditions worse. They all went to the election, we will improve this, we will improve that. Both right and left, conservatives and social democrats. With the coming to power of, or the rise of, after the fall of the Whitlam government in Australia and the rise of first Bill Hayden and then Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, for the first time, you saw this qualitative change. Vote for us. Why? Because we are the party that you can rely upon to take the hard decisions. We are the party you can rely on to be the responsible economic managers. We will take we are prepared to take the hard decisions. That hard decisions means decisions that will be hard on you, hard on ordinary people. Vote for us because we will implement austerity, and we're the ones courageous enough to implement austerity because that's what is needed. That's gone on now for 40 years. Of course, in the beginning, the implication is, well, austerity for a few years and then the economy will get better. But now this tighten your belts propaganda has gone on for 40 years. Even now the Labour, Jim Chalmers is the treasurer, budget issues, budget emergency, budget crisis. Always the constant refrain, the economy is fragile. You have to continue even now to tighten your belts. To the extent we can make improvements, they'll be very minor, basically symbolic and token, not substantial. This is because this has gone on for 40 years. Of course, it's had to have parallel political. It's had political consequences to go with it. The working class, to the extent it was mobilized in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s through trade unions, through the Labour Party itself, which had a left wing as well as a right wing and a centre. That has all been demobilized. Trade union membership has gone from 70% in the 70s down to what now? 10, 15%. Strikes have gone right down. The Labour Party has lost its members. I was in the Labour Party for a while because the Socialist Worker Party assigned me to do entry work in the Labour Party. And then I was in the Canberra branch, and the left-wing caucus of the Labour Party in Canberra would have 100 or 200 people at it at regular meetings. Within 12 months of the Labour government, Bob Hawke government, it had 10 people in it. It was demobilised and demoralised. So you've had over this 40 years, not only constant inculcation, tighten your belts. We can't promise anything significant, except low expectations. Parallel to that, alongside that, underpinning that, has been demobilisation of the traditional working class organisations, which were never revolutionary, but they were at least pretended to be pro-redistribution, or for some people in it, genuinely in favour, in support of redistribution of wealth. So you had, in all fields, an erosion of this social democratic organisation, mobilisation, and a deepening and an inculcation of much lower horizons of what people can expect. No one expects, and it's also why, you get this new phenomenon in the last 10 years, populism being used in a different way than it was in the 60s and 50s and 40s. Trump is the classic example, populist. Why do people use populist for an elite figure like Trump? Because unlike the liberals, unlike the social democrats, he actually promises to ordinary people, I will improve your situation. I will bring factories back to America. I know why your situation has got worse. The swamp needs to be drained. There are too many refugees. We are servicing too much shit house countries outside of the US. But all this scapegoating and reactionary demagoguery that was part of another kind of demagoguery, promising we will improve your situation. Because for 40 years, bourgeois political parties in general and politicians have vied away from making serious promises, even as demagoguery of significant improvement. So you start promising improvements to ordinary people, populism. And even the tone when people make the accusation populism, it's like as if you promise things to people, it's somehow negative. Well, in any case, you have this low horizons and demobilization. I think that's one side of the contradiction. The other side of the contradiction I think is the first side, I think everyone knows about and notes and comments on. I think the second side is a bit harder to, perhaps more difficult to grasp because it's a bit disguised and it's not so crystallized and sharpened. I think in the few articles I've mentioned this on Red Ant, I refer to it as the continuing widespread existence in Australian society of a democratic humanist sentiment. Partly it's a consequence of the 60s radicalization, but actually goes before that. I mean, don't forget, when Robert Menzies tried to ban the Communist Party of Australia through a referendum, a big majority of Australians voted against it. The referendum to recognise the existence of Aboriginals, big percentage voted for it. And even in more, of course, in the 60s, you had the anti-Vietnam War movement, which had huge mobilizations and big impact, women's liberation movement, gay rights movement. They were all big and had a significant impact on Australian society. The anti-apartheid movement. I don't know how many have seen references to this, but the number of people after the victory against apartheid, the number of people who came to see Nelson Mandela when he visited Sydney was huge. Then there's the huge march across the Sydney Harbour Bridge for Aboriginal reconciliation. None of this is revolutionary or even necessarily radical. But to my mind, it points to existence that within Australian society, there is a significant segment of people who have this strong democratic humanist sentiment. And I think in recent times, you can see it happen again. If there's someone killed, a black man, an Aboriginal First Nations person killed in a cell, you often see quite big spontaneous demonstrations. The last one was 10,000 people in Perth. When there were bushfires, huge demonstrations on climate change issue in response to bushfires. Other black deaths in other Black Lives Matter demonstrations. You have over the last 10 years regular, or I should say irregular, but large, spontaneous, or not spontaneous, but demonstrations called by people who the people who come don't know who called them. You had the students' protests around global change, global warming and climate change. I think there's so much evidence that there is this significant presence of democratic humanist sentiment in Australian society. But and of course, for a smaller segment of that, but still, I think has a big impact. There's also all of the agitation in people's consciousness and conscience that arises from issues to do with the global north versus the global south conflict. Polls say that 81% of Australians support a ceasefire in Gaza. 60%, poll published by The Guardian said, want the Australian government to do more. The existence of poverty in the global south, the imbalance between everyone knows now, everyone has heard, it's entered into popular consciousness, 1% or 5% or 10% of the population controls 50 to 60 to 70% of the wealth. That's entered into people's consciousness. The contradiction here is that that sentiment has become disassociated with any ideology. It's not associated with social democratic ideology, because that's over the last 45 has withered away as an ideology alive in society. It's certainly not connected to socialist ideology, which even when the Labor Party had an actual socialist left, it was still not a revolutionary socialist left, but it was a fairly active, quite active actually, socialist left. That's gone. Not only has this sentiment no ideology to connect to, of course, if there's no ideology, it's obviously the chances are there's no organization to connect to either. But I think even after 40 years, we can say there's not even the tradition to relate to. Tradition of class struggle, working class struggle, trade. You can't, that's even disappeared from, well, maybe not totally disappeared, but it's very marginal now in Australian society. No ideology, this sentiment exists. It doesn't connect with the ideology, it doesn't connect with the organization, it doesn't connect with even with tradition. But it's very important for us, I think, to note that it does exist. Otherwise, you can be defeated when you don't need to be defeated by those who say, oh, the only things Australians interested in are their mortgage rates, or more, mortgage payments, their interest rates, their material consumption. You can get into the Greens party style sanctimonious attitude towards working class people who feeling precarious, do think about their material, have to think about their material circumstances, and feeling alienated and bored, do go to consumption as a means to ameliorate that that alienation. But we should note that sentiment exists. It's a consequence of historical process over a long time. But what we have to note in particular is that it's no longer connected to an ideology. It's no longer connected to organization. And it's no longer connected even to tradition. But we should recognize here that it still exists. And in fact, the global North versus the global South situation, the situation of imperialism, does continue to stir it, as the Gaza-Palestine situation today indicates. But there's a consequence of this dissociation of sentiment from ideology. When protest does happen, when the sentiment does surface as protest, it's, first of all, it's fleeting. Demonstrations when the bushfires have around global warming, huge. Was there momentum? Was there follow-up? No, it's fleeting. And that's a consequence of it being not attached to an ideology and not being attached to an organization. It's fleeting, but it's also shallow because it's only through continual involvement around an issue that people read, study, hear, discuss, and gain depth of understanding. It's fleeting and it's shallow as a result of the dissociation between sentiment and ideology. And I think if we agree with this description, with this contradiction being at the center, it also helps to define what the left should be doing. It should be needing to campaign against, intervening against, contributing to a transformation of the fleeting character. This fleeting character is reflected in the existing left. An issue becomes hot, protest around it, it's no longer hot, move on to something else or wait to something else. There's not the commitment, it's a bit like Rurik was saying, to the overall movement. You build, whether the issue is hot because of something is exploded or not hot, you have to do ongoing work. In the particular Australian context, doing ongoing work is a key intervention against this fleeting character of protest sentiment, of protest activity that's a consequence of sentiment being disassociated from ideology. Means you need perseverance with campaigning, with ongoing campaigning, whether the issue is hot or cold, because whether an issue is hot or cold, that's determined by, I think, often bigger events somewhere else that are out of our control. But you need ongoing work, deepening people's understanding and facilitating the development and growth of infrastructure, campaigning infrastructure, that when you do need to protest, you can protest effectively, but also build on it. That requires ongoing campaigning. But there's also an implication here for that relates to the question of imperialism, because the depth you have to help provide is to understand that this takes place in a global context. The slogan that arisen, was it 10 years now or 15 years ago now, another world is possible. The word world is crucial. The campaigning, the ongoing campaigning also has to relate to deepening people's understanding and carrying out appropriate campaigns that are within the anti-imperialist framework. Persistence and perseverance are crucial to act against this fleeting character of manifestations of democratic humanist sentiment and sentiment. And actually, it's not only reflected in the up and down, on and off, or on and off is better description of the demonstrations that have taken place, even in polls. You look at the latest essential polls published by The Guardian. On any issue you want to mention, housing, global warming, climate change, gay liberation, on any issue, shows that no more than 30% of the population is satisfied. 70% to one level of it is dissatisfied. But where is it manifested? Where is this dissatisfaction with these policies manifested? They can't be manifested anywhere because there's no way, there's no pathway that they can be effectively manifested in an ongoing way. Now, this sentiment, of course, I call it democratic humanist. It's not revolutionary. It's not even immediately potentially revolutionary, because for that to happen, you need a change in objective conditions, where they realize that the democratic humanist values they have are never going to be implemented until the system changes, and that's usually that's only in your face. That's only a thing you realize when it's in your face and the system begins not to work. But I think that there is the potential for that sentiment to be organized and mobilized to win those reforms that can be won under capitalism, and which every time they are won, and even every time there's a big movement and they are not won, the contradictions of the system are sharpened. And that's going to open the eyes of more and more people. There's potential for more effective and bigger campaigns around decarbonizing Australia. There's potential for, movements around economic redistribution policies, increases in taxation or however they wanted to be formulated. And with 81% for ceasefire, there's surely potential for bigger and stronger mobilizations around Gaza. But the basic contradiction still means that everything has this fleeting and shallow character to it. So in this situation, what to do? Well, I've already said what needs to be done against fleetingness, against shallowness, for ongoing campaigning, ongoing movement building, and so on, and for continuous orientation to the anti-imperialist struggle and in the global north versus global south tension, because that awakens also both the humanist sentiment plus agitates people to think about why this situation exists. But of course, ongoing campaigning, persistence in that, giving it depth. Who's going to do that? Well, Red Ant can't, not unless it grows. Red Ant, an organization, Red Ant can do it if it grows, if there's more people involved. If when somebody gives a report like I'm giving today, it's not the work of one person, but a team. Let alone if you want to intervene and help building movements. You have to have more members. So that's the contradiction or the challenge perhaps for us, for people in Red Ant. If you want to be able to conduct that ongoing, serious campaigns, perseverance, building this campaign, that campaign, while propagandizing for the need for socialist change, full-blooded socialist change. If you want to be able to do all that, you have to have a much bigger organization than we have today, which means in the short term, the main task we face is to grow Red Ant, while not becoming an organization that's simply simply focused on its own growth. That wants to grow because growing will mean it can better relate. It wants to grow because growing means it can better intervene. It wants to grow because by growing, it will have a bigger capacity to convince people to explain things. And that's, I think, going to be a especially big challenge to do that in relation to, in particular, young people. Young people who can be active not for 10 more years, be lucky if I can be active for 10 more years, but for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. And who are in a situation where they can imagine, they can see another world is possible and another world is necessary. Whereas that's a harder change of consciousness to bring to older people than younger people. So the immediate need, a stronger and bigger organization that can contribute, not going to be able to do it all by itself, but can contribute to strengthening ongoing campaigns, can contribute to deepening understanding by everyone involved, and in the end can contribute to convincing people of the need, not just for the reforms that can be won under capitalism, to contribute to convince people that in the end, if we don't watch out, even the reforms that are won under capitalism will be taken away at the first opportunity the capitalists have to take them away. Win them now if we can, and over the last 100 years, there have been many reforms being won. Now, under neoliberalism, some being taken back. Win them, and if you want to hold on to them, hold on to the gains you make, then in the end, you're going to have a full-blooded revolutionary change. Winning people to that understanding is also, a part of the task. But again, none of this, building the campaigns in this way, getting rid of the fleeting character of protest, getting rid of the shallow nature of people just crapping on about this issue or that issue without studying it properly. We need a bigger organization. So if you haven't joined yet, please consider joining or at least supporting, because that's the only way any of these things can possibly be achieved. Thank you. Roger, over and out.